discussed the 13th chapter yesterday, where we understood about the concept of how the Purusha, the soul, who potentially has that very wide range of consciousness, how it gets restricted to become a Kshetragya, one whose consciousness is just limited to this field called as this body. We understood that science, and in the chapter we saw how Krishna, in text number 22 of 13th chapter, he says how it is karanam gunasangasya, because of this gunas, because of the shackles of these gunas, the soul gets intertwined with or entangled with this matter. So the science of gunas is something that we're going to discuss in today's chapter. Very, very interesting chapter. In fact, this is one chapter that Srila Prabhupada would say that if one can understand this chapter even through philosophical speculation, right, then one can understand these deeper truths of existence. So very, very special chapter. So let's begin with the invocatory prayers. So joining your palms together. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Ajnanatimirandhasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Pristhaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namine. Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Desha Tarine. Jaya Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. So let's begin chapter number 14, which is called as Guna Traya Vibhaga Yoga. The yoga talking about the three gunas, these three classifications of gunas, Guna Traya Vibhaga Yoga. Guna Traya Vibhaga Yoga. Right? So the word guna literally means like a thread, a rope. Right? We used the word shackles yesterday. So literally shackles, which are of three types, sattva, rajas and tamas. Right? Vibhaga means the classification, the types. So the yoga of these three types of gunas, or the yoga of these three types of modes of material nature, subject matter of this particular chapter, right? And if we understand analytically this specific chapter, right, we will be able to very astutely understand how this material nature works and how we are conditioned to this material nature, right? In fact, the first theme that we'll try to understand even before we begin this chapter is this word that we often use called as conditioning, right? What does the word conditioning mean? When perhaps some of you might have heard about this expression or this concept of conditioning wood, right? Wood, which is actually a it's not meant for use in outdoor environment, right? Because if it's very moist or if it's very wet, it immediately gets spoiled. It starts to rot, right? But sometimes there is a way of conditioning that wood where it's a long process. They actually take that wood, first they soak it in oil for sometimes as long as 1 year, and once the wood completely absorbs that oil, literally becomes like waterproof. And then using that they make different outdoor furniture, outdoor chairs or tables or whatever, and then also put a small layer of veneer over it, right? And basically what happens is that wood becomes conditioned for outdoor usage. So what does this word conditioning literally mean? It means when anything is prepared for its usage or for its existence in a foreign environment, right? Like in this case, this whole outdoor humid, moist environment is not the natural environment for wood, right? Of course, not just trees, but we're talking about wood here, right? And so you are conditioning it to make it usable in this environment. So likewise, the soul, the jiva, who is by nature, its natural environment actually is spiritual environment or the spiritual world. But this jiva has to be conditioned to now operate in this material world. So when I use this word, it is being conditioned, right? So many times we understand, many times we have a slightly oversimplified understanding that, when we say that the jiva is in this material world, the understanding is that the jiva's consciousness has right now been conditioned to material consciousness. So when I use the word conditioning, what exactly is being conditioned? It is the consciousness of the jiva which has been conditioned to operate in this material world, right? So this conditioning process is facilitated through these three modes of material nature, which are sattva, rajas, and tamas. So this agency of conditioning are these three gunas, right? Because for that soul to operate in this, or to operate in this material environment, or to interact with this world of matter, right, it needs to operate in a particular mode, and those modes are these three gunas, right? So to give you a even slightly more simplistic, a slightly oversimplified example, right? So imagine there are two people talking, trying to communicate to each other, right? They are standing far apart, maybe almost like say a good say 100 meters apart, right? And it's quite a distance, so they want to talk to each other, right? So what do? They devise a long tube in between them, and they decide, okay, let us now communicate to each other with this tube, right? So when there is a nice, smooth, obstruction free tube, when the person speaks from one end, their voice is easily received on the other end, right? So that is pretty smooth transfer of their words, their communication, right? When this relatively smooth, still there will be some loss, right? It is not as good as two people sitting right next to each other and communicating. That's like as clean, as clear a communication it can happen from a normal sense, right? So because of this long tube, they talk through it. It almost sounds like the person is standing right next to you, but it is still not pure communication, right? So that kind of obstruction free communication is what is, we call it as sattva communication. sattva, where the consciousness of this jiva is manifesting in its almost pure state. It is not full, but it is almost. But sometimes, let us say, I have some obstacles in between. Then what happens? The sound bounces off the walls, it gets a little attenuated, it loses its intensity. Sometimes it may go to some slight distortions, and you may not get the pure sound on the other side, right? Think of that to be something like your rajasic. That's what rajoguna is, where the consciousness is not transferred so purely, there is still some distortion, right? Now imagine that you have huge blockages to the point where sometimes the sound may not get through to the other side also, right? Or even if it goes through, it may be very, very faint, or sometimes completely distorted in its nature, right? So that is like the tamas aspect. That is how the consciousness in tamoguna is expressed, where the consciousness of the pure soul gets completely distorted, and it's manifest in a completely different way, right? That is the tamasic way of communication or of expression of consciousness. So these three modes in which the consciousness is being transmitted, sattva, rajas, and tamas, this is basically how this world is operating, or how the jiva gets conditioned to this material world. So indirectly, what these three gunas are doing, they are basically allowing or binding the consciousness of the jiva to become absorbed in this world of matter. That is what we call as material consciousness. So material consciousness is nothing but pure consciousness being tinged by this sattva, rajas, or tamas. And therefore, we end up manifesting sattvic consciousness or rajasic consciousness or tamasic consciousness, right? So the details about these three gunas is something that Krishna is going to elaborate upon, right? So we begin straight away. So the first, taking that theme of conditioning of the jiva, the first 13 verses, Krishna is going to talk about that same theme, about the material conditioning of the soul. The material conditioning of the soul, right? So straight away, Lord picks up, even before Arjuna asks any question, Krishna picks up his theme from the last chapter, and then he says, again I shall declare to you this supreme wisdom, the best of all knowledge, knowing which all the sages have attained the supreme perfection. And by becoming fixed in this knowledge, one can attain to this transcendental nature like my own. Because if we understand these workings of sattva, rajas, and tamas, we can transcend them and attain to the state of shuddha sattva or pure sattva, which is the pure state of the soul, without any tinges of raja or tamas, right? So he says that this total material substance is called as Brahman. This total material substance is called Brahman, is the source of the birth, and it is that Brahman that I impregnate, right? So indirectly Krishna is indicating that there is some source to this Brahman, or there's something even superior to this Brahman, an answer to which we will discuss at the end of this chapter. So right now I'm going to leave it as a blank, but we'll come back and fill that blank at the end of this chapter, right? And it is this Brahman that I impregnate and make possible the birth of all living beings, right? And then he continues, next verses, it should be understood that all species of life, O Arjuna, are made. So basically, in this aggregate called as Brahman, in that form, Krishna impregnates the material nature, and he says he impregnates all the living entities into this. Indirectly, what it means is that the pure soul, whose existence is linked to that divine state, to the spiritual state, to that state called as Brahman, to that From that consciousness, the soul gets conditioned to material nature, or in other words, it is as good as saying that the souls have now entered into that material nature. So literally, when we use the expression the soul has entered into material nature, or the soul is born in this material world, right? We have to understand what it means is that the soul is now conditioned to material consciousness, right? So this principle of conditioning that we just discussed earlier, that is what Krishna talks about, right? And then he says that understand that I am the seed-giving father of all this, right? And what exactly this material nature? He says this material nature is basically just a combination of three things. What are they? It consists of these three gunas: sattvam, rajas, tamas iti guna prakriti sambhavaha. So sattva, rajas, and tamas. When we use the word material nature, it is just a combination of these three: sattva, rajas, tamas. I often give this example that how, we have these three primary colors, right? And it is said that the human eye can actually perceive around 16.1 million shades of colors. But all those 16.1 million shades are just the permutations and combinations of these three primary colors. Likewise, we need to understand this sattva, rajas, and tamas are like these three fundamental building blocks of this entire material energy. Literally, even all those 24 elements that we spoke about yesterday are also the evolutes, or the mutations or the transformations because of triggered by the sattva, rajas, and tamas, right? So that is how fundamental state of matter we are talking about here. Even the sattva, rajas, tamas, there are the building block, the fundamental energies which is a building block for all this earth, water, fire, air, ether, and so on. And also subtle element, even the mind, the intelligence, they are all a product of the sattva, rajas, and tamas, right? Now, after describing this, Krishna now gives some very, very simple, easy to understand definitions of these three: sattva, rajas, and tamas. In fact, for the remainder of the chapter, Krishna is only going to illuminate the characteristics of these. And why this chapter is so interesting, because this is like a very, very, very objectively realizable chapter. Because when we know here are A, B, C, D, E, these are the characteristics of sattva, these are the characteristics of rajas, these are characteristics of tamas. So when we understand this chapter from that kind of an objective way, we can very easily see the action of these three modes around us and on us. We can understand how these modes are influencing me right now, right? Like, for example, Krishna describes that this mode of goodness, sattva, is illuminating. The nature of sattva, right? It is illuminating. And it frees one from all sinful reactions. And one who's situated in the sattva is conditioned by happiness. Happiness and knowledge, and the happiness that comes out of knowledge, that is the characteristic of this sattva. Right? Such person is, when you say it's illuminating, meaning that the one's awareness, one's perception is completely clear. That's what we illuminated with knowledge. Once their senses, their perception is so strongly illuminated by the right knowledge, with the right understanding, then naturally one experiences happiness. Even, and it's very interesting how Krishna uses the term that they are also conditioned to happiness. So understand, even the so-called sattvic happiness is also the result of some conditioning. So nothing to be proud about that way, right? Likewise, then the mode of passion is born out of unlimited desire and longing, right? So this is the characteristics of rajas. It is born out of desires and longings. And one who's influenced by this rajogun, they are bound to fruitive material action. So fruitive mentality or fruitive actions is what they are bound to. While the previous sattva person is satisfied, contented, happy, one who's influenced by this rajas is constantly motivated by these fruitive actions. That's their tendency there, right? Like that. Then we see, what about tamogun? It is said that the mode of darkness born out of ignorance is a delusion of all embodied living entities. This is a characteristic of the tamogun, right? Such people in the mode of madness, indolence, and sleep, that's what they bind them. So it's a state of ignorance and madness, sleep. These are the characteristics of somebody in this particular state. Ignorance, madness, sleep, right? These are the characteristics of somebody in this particular state, like that. So then he goes on, he continues a little more further. Then he says that how the mode of goodness conditions one to happiness, passion to fruitive actions, and ignorance to madness. And he says that these three gunas, they are constantly fighting for supremacy among themselves, right? So sometimes sattva takes over, sometimes rajoguna takes over, sometimes tamoguna takes over, and they're always fighting for supremacy among themselves. And how do we know then which guna I'm operating? Because we are talking about all these three gunas operating simultaneously, sometimes one taking over or sometimes other being defeated, right? So when somebody is conditioned by this sattva, they said that one experiences the gates of the body are illuminated by knowledge. What do you mean the gates of this body? Basically all our sense organs, right, primarily, right, they are illuminated by knowledge, which means that when I see something, when I hear something, or in short, when I perceive something, I perceive things for what they are rather than not what they sometimes mean to me. For somebody who's in the rajogun, right, for them, because they are driven by desire, right? Now, for example, when somebody sees a wallet lying on the street, right? So when a rajoguni person sees that, one immediately sees, oh, this is I can potentially take that money and I can utilize it for my own fruitive desire, fulfill my own desires. But whereas somebody who's sattva guna, he'll just see, oh, this belongs to someone else, so it is my duty to return this wallet to that person. A tamoguni person who's in madness, who's in ignorance, says, oh, somebody dropped their wallet, let me just take it, pick it and throw it in the river so that nobody will get it. That is how ignorant the tamoguni person is. So like that. So because then he continues, in the rajoguni person is, they are dulled by intense endeavor, uncontrollable desire, hankering, right? Lead, all of these are symptoms of that fruitive mentality. Whereas madness and illusion, that's what's the characteristic of tamogun. So this is how the soul gets conditioned by these three gunas. In fact, many times we don't realize what we may think is right or wrong is not really the right or wrong. It is just the conditioning that we are experiencing of those gunas. Just like how in the previous example, that person who picked up that wallet and threw it in the river was convinced at that moment that that is the right thing to do, because that's what the tamogun, the mode of ignorance, convinces that person that this is the right thing to do. As right as a sattvic person felt that I have to go return it back to the owner of that particular wallet, right? So therefore we why the science of gunas is so important is, many times we live in this world where we end up making many relative truths or as the absolute truth. Relative truths means truths that are influenced by these gunas, by the sattva, rajas and tamo gunas. Whereas absolute truth means that truth which is not influenced by sattva, rajas and tamas. The more we try to align with the absolute truth, the more we become free from the influence of the gunas. If not directly the absolute truth, at least we need to come to that level of sattva. And that's what Krishna explains in the next verse, right? Where from text number 14 to 20, Krishna is going to give us further elaboration on this gunas. So let's discuss that. From text number 14 to 20, we are going to hear certain further characteristics of these gunas. Right? So we can actually, in fact, this entire chapter, I will later advise you to make some kind of a table. It's very easy. You can make a table like this: sattva, rajas, and tamas. Right? And you can actually very nicely make your own little reference sheet. So like how are they? So it says, one who dies in this mode of goodness, he attains purer, higher state of planet. So for somebody who goes through death in this guna, they go to a higher planetary system. Whereas one who dies in the mode of passion takes birth among those engaged in fruitive activities. So this is among those who are involved in the fruitive activities, fruitive actions. And those who are born in ignorance, they take birth in the animal kingdom. That's the lowest state of consciousness. Right? Then the result of actions. The result of pious actions is pure and is said to be in the mode of goodness. Whereas actions done in the mode of passion result in misery. And actions performed in the mode of ignorance, they result in foolishness. So in terms of the results that we do, and sometimes you will see, especially when we are driven by fruitive mentality or when we are driven by some sense gratification, you may experience some immediate pleasure, but it will lead to a misery eventually. So that's what it means, right? Whereas a tamoguni result means that it was misery right from the beginning till the end, right? At least rajogun may seem little exciting. It may seem that you are experiencing some happiness in the beginning, but finally it's going to transform into misery, like that. So then, So then, regarding actions, then he further continues that from the mode of goodness, real knowledge develops. So we get knowledge in sattva, whereas from the mode of passion, greed develops. Whereas the mode of ignorance, one develops illusion. Right? So again, why this understanding of sattvas, of the three gunas, is important. That moment we identify that I am getting overwhelmed with greed, or I'm getting overwhelmed with illusion, or confused with illusion, we need to understand that right now it seems like I'm being influenced by one of these gunas. So if I start adopting something sattvic, if I start adopting a sattvic lifestyle, if I start getting influenced by the sattva, I will be able to overcome my illusion and greed and operate from a state of knowledge, like that. So because finally, many times all we need to do is just change the guna in which we are operating, and that is going to change our whole responses to life, right? And this is also a very important principle, because many times we, especially in the modern age, people are looking for some technique-oriented methods to find solutions to problems of life. Like, okay, here this is one technique to become happy. This is one technique to overcome depression. This is one technique to overcome ignorance, right? But rather, the Gita gives a more holistic approach that, look, these techniques may give you some temporary solace, but if you really want a genuine change, we need to change our consciousness, and we need to change the guna in which we are operating. We need to elevate from rajas and tamas to a more sattva centric operation of our consciousness, like that. So that is why this is a very, very important science to understand, as Krishna and Prabhupada also talks about that in the first purport of this chapter itself, like that. Then continuing further, Krishna explains in text number 18, those situated in the mode of goodness, they gradually go upwards to higher planetary systems. Those in the mode of passion, they are born in the earthly planetary system, which is the place for fruitive activity. And those, they go to lower planetary systems also, like that. Then, when one sees properly that actually all activities, no other performer is at work other than the modes of material nature, and he knows that the Supreme Lord who's transcended modes of material nature, he attains to my spiritual nature. So why understanding these modes is so important? We discussed this in yesterday's discussion as well, elaborated a lot, that how prakrute kriyamanani, actually all that the living entity doing is just expressing its desire. And the desire, when it gets manifested to the channel of sattva, material nature operates, the sattvic material nature operates, and it creates this experience of sattva and an action and the result of sattva. But when the spirit soul's desire is manifesting through the channel of rajas, to the mode of rajas, that's why the word mode of operation is such a wonderful word to capture exactly what is happening. Literally, the soul's desire or the soul's consciousness is just manifesting in these modes through these channels of sattva, rajas, or tamas, right? And therefore, when one understands that actually it is all this, what I'm seeing as this material nature operating, or even my body, mind operating, actually it is just these three gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas, doing all the action, right? However, the Lord, when he operates from a platform beyond these three gunas. And that is why yesterday when we mentioned how when we make Paramatma as our role model, Paramatma, he acts beyond these three gunas. When Lord Krishna appears in this world, he operates beyond these three gunas. So by understanding that, we will understand that how one can, while living in this world, one need not be operating under the influence of these three gunas. That is the state of, acting from the state of non-reactionary work. The moment I operate under the influence of gunas, I'm going to get reactions to my work. Even sattva also creates a particular reaction, not just rajas and tamas, right? But at least relatively, the reactions of sattva are not as detrimental. Therefore, it is a more safer mode to operate. But still, eventually, we have to transcend even those the sattva guna also, like that. And that is the state from which the Lord operates, like that. So then, when the embodied living being is able to transcend these three modes associated with this material body, such a person becomes free from birth and death, and thus one can enjoy a transcendental life, like that. So the whole point of Krishna's describing these three modes is that understand that the soul's consciousness is right now shackled by these three gunas, Arjuna. So when Krishna spoke in the first 6 chapters about operating in a detached way, detached engagement, operating in a way that you in non-reactionary work, basically what Krishna is saying is operate from a mode which is beyond these three gunas. In essence, the essence of all the first 6 chapters is that the living entity, that the jiva or the living entity needs to operate from a mode beyond these three gunas, right? So naturally then Arjuna has a question, then Krishna, how do I transcend these three modes, right? Because it makes sense. Okay, it seems like my consciousness is right now conditioned, and that is how I, the Purusha, have become conditioned to think myself as a Kshetragya. Then how do I transcend these three gunas? So from text number 21 to 27, Krishna is going to talk about how to transcend these modes. Transcending the modes or transcending the gunas, right? So he asks, oh Lord, how do I know a person if they have genuinely transcended the modes? What is the behavior of such a person, right? And how does such a person actually transcend these modes? So from text number 22 to 25, Krishna is going to talk about such an advanced soul who has actually transcended these gunas. What are the symptoms of such a person, right? In text number 22, we're going to see the symptoms of such a person. So Krishna says that, oh Arjuna, he who does not hate illumination, attachment, and delusion when they are present, or long for them when they disappear, right? And he who is So in terms of the symptoms, such a person neither hates nor longs for these three things. What are these three things? For illumination, that is sattva; attachments, which is rajas; and which is delusion, which is ignorance. Right? One who neither hates nor longs, these three things, such a person, those are symptoms of such a person. Now, throughout the Bhagavad Gita, we've heard the same concept in many other ways. We heard in the second chapter the character was Sthita Prajna. In the fourth chapter also we discussed the person of such a person, who operates from the mode of akarma, right? In the sixth chapter we discussed the symptoms of such an advanced yogi. In the fifth chapter also we discussed one who's situated at Brahmabhuta platform. So repeatedly Krishna spoke about this, but specifically in this chapter we are understanding the same concept, but more from the point of view of a person who has transcended these three modes. Because ultimately, what do I mean by a person who's uninfluenced by this world? Means such a person has transcended these three gunas, like that. Then what is the behavior of such a person? Right? So from text number 23 to 25, Krishna talks more about the behavior of such a person. So it says, Na nirvanti kankshati udasinavad asino. He who is unwavering and undisturbed through all these reactions of material qualities remains neutral and transcendental, knowing that the modes alone are active, who is situated in the self and regards happiness and distress alike. He who looks upon earth, stone, a piece of gold with equal eye, who is equal towards the desirable and undesirable, who is steady, situated equally well in praise and blame, honor and dishonor, who treats alike both friends and enemy, who has renounced all material activities. Such a person is said to have transcended the modes of material nature. Right? So basically, such a person maintains a sense of equanimity with respect to the worldly dualities, heat and cold, loss and gain, with respect to the things, sometimes even to the people, friends, enemies, etc. That is the behavior of such a person who has transcended these three modes, right? But then what is a method? How do I actually transcend these three modes? Right? Very, very important verse of this chapter, where Krishna explains in text number 26, Krishna reveals what is the way to actually transcend these three modes. He says, Mamchayo avyabhicharena bhakti yogena sevate sagunan samatitaitan brahma bhuyaya kalpate. So one unto me, mamchayo, unto Krishna, avyabhicharena bhakti yogena means, avyabhicharini means that, unwavering, without any fail. So one who engages in, so by engaging in unfailing, unrelenting, pure, unfailing devotional service or bhakti, mamcha avicharena bhakti yogena sevate, at once sagunanan samatitaitan brahma bhuyaya kalpate. Such a person at one transcends the three modes. By unwavering bhakti, one transcends the modes. And such a person comes to the state what is called as Brahma Bhuta. Right? Brahma Bhuta here means that a state where one understands that, oh yes, now I am that, that I have experienced that qualitative oneness as that I am that spiritual sense. Right? Not in terms of the quantitative, but more of a qualitative identity that I am that soul, I am that Satchidananda. Just like how the Supreme Lord is Satchidananda, he is that Supreme, he is a Parabrahman. I also understand that I am that Brahman, Aham Brahmasmi. Very, very famous, Vedic aphorism, that I am that Brahman, I am that spiritual entity. So, right? So that is understanding that one develops. How? Mamchayo avyabhicharena bhakti yogena. By this unfailing, unwavering devotional service, one transcends the three modes. Right? So again, you see, repeatedly we see this theme throughout the Bhagavad Gita, how Krishna, he very directly or indirectly, he is urging Arjuna to bring about that connection of bhakti. Whether we saw in the Karma Yoga chapter or Jnana Yoga chapter or Dhyana Yoga chapter, that element of bhakti, that connection of bhakti is what that gives perfection to any form of yoga, because that is what helps one transcend the modes of this material nature, like that. And in text number 27, he explains that how Brahmano hi pratishtaham, that Brahman which I spoke about, I am the basis of that Brahman. That impersonal Brahman is actually my effulgence. I am foundation of that, right? And that is the eternal constitutional position of all ultimate happiness. So if you go back to our beginning of this chapter, we put a blank here, that what is the source of this Brahman. We understand that the source of this Brahman is actually Krishna himself. Brahmano hi pratishtaham. I am the basis of that impersonal Brahman. That Brahman who is glorified throughout the Upanishads, that Brahman who is glorified in the Vedas and in the Vedanta Sutra, right? That Brahman who even the impersonalists are trying to approach, actually I am that basis of that. And Prabhupada very nicely explained that this Brahman is nothing but the effulgence, the halo of Lord Krishna. And that is a state that, when we talk about the state of Brahma Bhuta or Brahma Bhuyaya Kalpate, attaining that state, is basically we are coming in contact with Krishna's impersonal state or that Brahman state, like that, right? So that is the way to actually transcend these three modes of material nature. So this theme of the three modes is something that is going to repeat again in the Bhagavad Gita. In the 17th chapter and the 18th chapter, Krishna is going to elaborate more about that. But we understand the basic signs of the three modes, like that. So it's a very simple, straightforward chapter, but also very, very powerful chapter, because we now know a very objective way of understanding what is that gunas, what am I going through. Just by looking at it, it's a very good self-diagnosis tool, a self-analysis tool. Just knowing by the symptoms that of these three gunas, I know which guna I'm being influenced by, right? So like that. So I'll very quickly summarize what we discussed today. So we began this discussion by understanding the concept of conditioning. In the previous chapter, Krishna spoke that how that Purusha, Prakriti Stohi, Bhungte Prakriti Jan Gunan, that Purusha is bound to this Prakriti. What do you mean by Purusha is bound? The consciousness of the Jiva is conditioned to this body, to this material understanding. And that agency of conditioning are these three gunas. So the pure consciousness of the soul gets conditioned by the sattva, rajas, and tamas. And what does the word conditioning mean? It to prepare something to operate in a foreign environment. So that pure soul, the jiva, which only operates in spiritual consciousness or in spiritual world or in spiritual reality, now becomes conditioned to operate in material consciousness. And that is how the gunas condition us. And we also discussed how each of these three gunas, tamas, rajas, and sattva, they are just purer and purer ways of expression of consciousness. Tamogun being the most impure way, rajogun intermediate, and sattva the relatively purest way of operating, right? So then we began this concept of material conditioning and how these the sattva, rajas, and tamas, they have this defining characteristics of how sattva conditions one to happiness, rajas conditions one to fruitive mentality, and tamas conditions one to madness, right? And then we saw certain further description of these gunas, how when a person dies in that sattvic consciousness, one goes to higher planetary systems, is born in those higher lokas. Whereas somebody who dies in the rajogun, they are born in the earthly planetary systems where they are engaging in more fruitive action. And when somebody dies in the stamoguna, then one is born in the animal kingdom, operating under this, or when we go into even the lower planetary systems also. And we also saw any action which is performed, if it is in Sattva Guna, it leads to a purer state of our consciousness. In Rajoguna, it leads to misery. And in Tamoguna, it's only going to bind us further in that darkness and ignorance and foolishness, like that. And then basically we understood that because these are just gunas, these are modes of operation, this is not who we are. Right now, we are just being kicked around or tossed around by these three gunas, but the living entity needs to understand this and learn to operate from a plane beyond these three gunas, right? So what does it mean now in this context? So after that we saw what are the symptoms and behavior of such a person who has transcended the modes, and we saw that now when somebody operates from the platform of this unwavering, unfailing devotional service, then one transcends the gunas. So what does that mean here, right? So when a person, again, when imagine if one notices a child who's lost, you encounter a child who's lost. So at one level, one may say, okay, here a tamoguni person will try to exploit that particular child, or may even mislead that child in some way that the child gets further lost, and will completely take that child away from whatever state of joy that person is. So in short, they end up creating more damage to that particular situation. Whereas a rajoguni person in that situation, what does a person do? He says, how can I somehow gain something out of the scenario? Maybe I will exploit this particular child and make the child into my personal servant, engage the child in child labor and gain some profit out of it. That is the mentality of a rajoguni person. A satoguni person may think, oh, maybe this child is lost, I will offer some food to that particular child. Maybe I will offer some balloons or some toys for that particular child, and thereby I will give some solace to that particular child. But understand, even that solution is not a very good solution, because finally we are not fully addressing the problem. We are only giving a temporary solution. But when one understands the child has a relationship with their parents, and the natural state of the child is in proximity or in the house of their parents, when one understands that, one will take the child back to the parents and hand them over to that parent, like that. So likewise, when that is operating beyond the gunas. So when a pure devotee looks at this particular world, one does not see this world from a sattvic satisfaction point of view, or rajasic exploitation point of view, or from a tamoguni illusory point of view, but one learns to see everything's unique connection with Krishna and sees, how can I engage this in Krishna's service? How can I connect this back to Krishna? That is the meditation of a pure devotee. And that is what it means to operate free from these three gunas. Because right now, there is always, even in the sattvic sattva guna, it is still, there is the operation under the influence of the ego, because you're looking at your own personal happiness and personal joy. But when one transcends beyond these three modes, one learns to operate purely from the point of view of what will give pleasure to Krishna, or how is something very strongly connected to Krishna. That connection, one acknowledge, or one consciousness is purely tuned towards Krishna, or one becomes very Krishna conscious. That is what it means to operate beyond the three gunas, right? And therefore, when in the next verse, when Krishna talks about that, how do I transcend these modes? When Krishna says, by unfailing bhakti, that is the theme that we saw, in the 9th chapter, in the 10th chapter, we saw that Krishna is reiterating that, but now explaining from the point of view of, it is not just that some magic happens when one starts engaging devotional service. One's consciousness starts to transcend from these three gunas. That is how one experiences liberation from these three gunas. One transcends the three gunas, or one experiences that state of Brahma Bhuta, like that. So we understood again, very, very powerful chapter. In fact, by understanding this text number 26, one will be able to substantiate all the claims that Krishna has made about the power of bhakti or the power of devotional service, right? It is not just some kind of an abstract understanding, but rather one actually factually what happens is one's consciousness transcends the influence of these three modes when one operates from that level of a pure devotion, like that, right? However, at least while we are in this world, even before we operate from the zone of transcending the three gunas, at least we should bring ourselves to a level of sattva, because that sattva is a very illuminating state, and that becomes a very fertile ground for us to transcend these three gunas and enter into a state of sattva guna, or the pure state of the soul, like that. All right. So these are the few thoughts which I wanted to share in today's discussion. Fairly straightforward chapter, but let's see if students have any questions or comments. Okay. Yeah. We have a question. Gail, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hare Krishna Prabhu. Yes. Thank you. So, okay, one thing is the ignorance, the mode of ignorance leads to illusion. The mode of passion leads to greed, which is also due to illusion. So what is the specific nature of the illusion that comes out of the mode of ignorance that's different from the other modes, which are also influenced by which are also subjected to illusion?
Right. So the illusion or delusion or ignorance or madness that is spoken of in the tamogun, right? At least in the rajogun, a person is thinking about some selfishness about themselves. At least they are not creating self-harm. A tamoguni person, their decisions and actions will end up creating harm for even themselves. A rajogun person at least operate from the level of selfishness. But a tamoguni person ends up creating even self-harm. That is why it is a kind of madness, like that.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, even though all kinds of illusion do lead to a kind of self-harm, but I guess you mean more on the physical level, maybe, or
physical,
even
mental, karmic, multiple levels.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Also, only the modes of nature are acting. And I don't know, is Durga Devi the personification or the embodiment of the modes? What is her role therefore?
Okay. So Prakriti personified is represented by Durga Devi. So she is that Maya Shakti personified. And this, and you can say these three modes are basically energies of Prakriti. Right? So in the Vedic culture, the understanding of Durga, she is the personification of this entire material energy put together. She is that Shakti. Shakti means that unlimited energy, which is what this material nature is. She is the personification of all that unlimited energy. And these three gunas are, basically manifestation of, of that one energy, like that.
But the modes of nature, they are essentially dead matter, right?
No, it's not exactly like dead matter. Think of these three modes just as forms of energies, material energies, which transform to create matter. Like all this world of all this matter that you are seeing all around you is basically a result of these three gunas, right? Or if I may give a simile compared to modern science, like today we understand everything is made up of fundamental atoms, and atoms themselves are made up of subatomic particles, neutrons, protons, electrons. So scientists even have a theory that even those electrons, the subnuclei particles, are also these quarks and so on. They themselves are also they have formed from some fundamental energy which is there at the time of creation. So even matter is coming from energy is what modern science also agrees upon. So think of, along the same lines, that even this so-called physical matter that we are perceiving, right, are actually these manifestation of these three gunas. Yeah.
So the manifestation of the gunas, which the manifestation is dead, but the gunas from which they evolve, that's not dead.
Can you repeat yourself?
Yes. So the physical matter that is in our environment, that is dead.
Yes.
But
yes.
the gunas from which they have evolved, that is not dead. Or so, what is the nature actually?
Yeah. So when you say are they dead or alive, if you're saying referring to are they sentient or not, right?
Yeah, especially because the embodiment of the gunas is Durga Devi, who is sentient being. So therefore, it seems like, okay, if the modes are her energy, do we say?
Yes. You can understand that way. Yes. So the gunas in themselves are not sentient, but Prakriti Devi, Maya Devi, Durga Devi herself, she is sentient entity like that. But what we otherwise call as the manifestation of the Durga in this material world, in the form of this whole world of matter, it is that manifestation of her three energies of Sat, Rajas, and Tamas.
Right. And therefore, that's why I said earlier that the modes, they are not sentient. They're dead. But it seemed like you were saying that we cannot say that. It's only their transformations are dead. So, now it seems like, I don't know which way it is.
So when you're saying about modes as dead matter, right? So usually when we use the terminology dead matter, we are talking about when this Prakriti starts its manifested state, that is when we start calling it as matter. Like even Pradhan is also very, very subtle state. It is unmanifested state of matter. And even beyond Pradhan are these three gunas, right? Okay, I'll give you a slightly extended example. When we eat food, right? We eat fruits, we eat bread, we eat rice, dal, chapati. We eat all these things, but ultimately they are all transformations of dirt, of soil, right?
Yes.
So all these physical elements that we see, earth, water, fire, air, ether, all of them, they are all manifestations or transformations of that fundamental state of matter called as Mahat or Pradhan. Right? So if an agricultural field is like that Pradhan or Mahat, its transformations in the form of these varieties of foods that we see are this earth, water, fire, air, ether, so on. So usually when we refer to the word dead matter, we are talking at that level of, either the soil, the dirt, or the banana or potato or mango, etc. But the gunas are even subtler. They are even beyond the conception of even Pradhan, right? So that is why we are not, we cannot even call it as, when the moment you use the word matter, we are already saying that it is manifested already. But these gunas are imperceptible that way.
Okay,
right?
and so
that's why I keep coming back to the term material energy or forms of material energy.
Okay, and so in that analogy of dirt that gets transformed ultimately as, crops, right?
Right.
In that analogy, where is Durga Devi?
So Durga Devi is that agency who's causing all of this to happen remotely. Right? She is under her supervision, all this agriculture is happening.
Including Pradhan, like...
Yes, including Pradhan, all of that entire aggregate, all those 24 elements put together, all of that whole functioning is happening because of her, under her supervision.
Okay, so then she is like farmer, maybe.
Yeah, you can look at it that way. Yes, farmer is the one who's farming, right? Yes, that's a good extension to our discussion. Yes, very nice. Yeah.
Okay, last thing, Prabhu, very quickly. Um, uh, the we're talking about the conditioning of the soul. Actually, we're talking about the consciousness that emanates from the soul. That is what is being conditioned, right? Because the soul never changes.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So it seems, therefore, that although the soul never changes, I guess the consciousness that emanates from the soul does change. Because it can become conditioned. Like, so in your wood, the conditioned wood analogy that you gave, the oil is the modes of nature, and the conditioned wood that gets soaked by that's soaked in the oil is the consciousness that emanates from the soul rather than the soul proper.
Yes. Because the soul is always, that is why the soul is unchangeable, immutable. When we read the second chapter, the soul is never touched by the gunas. It is the consciousness of the soul that gets conditioned.
Okay, that's interesting because there is really no physical separation of the consciousness from the soul. So it's kind of like I don't know if you can call it a Gentile beta type of deal,
Right.
But it's interesting that although there's no separation, the one gets conditioned, but the other remains intact, right?
Like for example, I think last time I mentioned this example. If you are busy watching the television and you're watching a very intense drama, and suddenly in the drama, say the character dies, and it's a very sad scene, automatically you start crying. Actually, nothing went wrong in your life, but your consciousness right now is tuned into the drama. You start going through because you're conditioned by the drama. Your life now becomes a drama, though you are not there. You and the drama have nothing to do with each other.
Yeah.
Right? That is how the soul, when you say the soul's consciousness is conditioned, the soul is right now described very nicely in Chaitanya Charitamrita as Krishna Bahirmukh, meaning that we have turned away from Krishna. Therefore, Bhoga Vanchakar. Because we have turned away from Krishna, we are now looking towards Maya or this material energy. We get conditioned to this idea of Bhoga, desires, enjoyment. I am the center of the universe. I am the master. I am the controller, and so on.
Yeah,
like that.
Okay, and we did say that the oil that's conditioning the wood, that's the modes of nature of which our bodies are comprised, or even whatever even dead matter, right? Can we say that the dead matter is analogous to the oil? Even so, at various stages of material nature, from the grossest stage to the most subtle stage, those things are conditioning the soul.
See, everything around you is comprised of the modes, and everything is conditioning you. Like we're going to talk about this later. Like food that we eat, the moment I come in contact with rajasic food, my consciousness is going to get affected by that rajasic food. Right? The moment I come in contact with the tamasic person, or I go to a tamasic environment, immediately that tamogun is going to affect me. So yes, everything in this material world is constantly conditioning us.
Okay, beautiful.
Or it has a potential to condition us, but if we are protected by our devotional practice, we can learn to transcend them like that.
Thank you so much for your beautiful answers, Prabhu. Thank you.
Thank you. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Okay. Janavaji, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, Hare Krishna, Prabhu. Thank you so much. My question was, we spoke about the three modes of material nature. I've always tried to understand the concept. I know this is off topic, we might digress, but how does the soul's free will concept plays, and let's say if we are transcending all the three modes of material nature, how does that uh, free will comes in, and then how does that work really in context of this subject matter that we are understanding?
So if I understood your question right, that what happens to free will when one is conditioned and one is not conditioned? Is it like that?
That's one way of putting. So let's say that soul is immutable and unchangeable, and they don't die, and they are not born. They have their own choices and free will. And once they come in contact with material modes of nature, they operate under that.
Mm-hmm.
They are still having free will and choices that they can make,
Mm-hmm.
right? So how is that connected with the three modes, and also when one is transcending the three modes?
Okay. So actually, as long as we are under the influence of these three modes, the soul really does not fully exercise its free will. Even our free will is right now influenced. Like for example, let's say a person who has certain habits, a person who has some addictions, right? So a person who has some addiction, they what choice they are going to make, even without you you don't have to be an astrologer to know what an addict is going to do. They are going to go back to their addictions, right? So that is an example of how addictions are basically where the consciousness is in a very deep dark state of tamas. So you see that how their ability to exercise their consciousness is curtailed by the tamogun. Along with that, their ability to exercise their free will is also very much curtailed. So their desires are very much, the result of their past impressions, past samskaras, and literally they are going into a cyclical spiral and taking the soul deeper and deeper into the conditioning, or deeper into deeper ignorance. Right? So as long as we're bound by these gunas, we really are not exercising our full free will. Right? We are very much influenced. Our present choices are very much influenced by our past impressions, our past samskaras, and so on. Right? So when we understand that despite being so heavily conditioned, if I at least come to a level of sattva, my ability to express my own genuine free will, it starts to blossom. That is why spirituality is best operated from that sattva guna, where you relatively have a much better or a higher chance of expressing your natural free will. And that is why we are able to make the right choices and continue further to the point where I come to a state of my soul where I can truly express my choice. Right? So that is why we see, such a pure devotee, their choices, they can transcend their definitely their rajasic and tamasic tendencies for sure. But even sometimes certain sattvic recommendations that the Vedas also give, they're able to transcend even those and operate purely for the sake of pleasure of Krishna. That is the complete expression of the free will of the jiva. Because understand, whenever we use the words like free will of the jiva, it is not about acting in our worldly understanding. Free will or independence means acting as per my choice. But actually, the real free will or the real expression of free will of the jiva is when it is in relation to Krishna's service. That is what it means in its perfect state. Because the jiva is not going to desire anything other than that in its natural state. That is its right expression of free will, or that is its free will. Like that. So that manifests in a more purer and purer way in when that particular soul is free from these three gunas. Like that. So that does it add some clarity to your understanding?
Yes, Prabhu, it does. And also when we mention that when we act on a purer platform, and then we are acting according to our fundamental nature, which is to be able to serve Krishna in devotion.
Right, exactly. So when we are acting under certain higher order, higher instruction, even though at this stage I may have not transcended the gunas, But because I'm operating from an instruction which is beyond the gunas, we also start experiencing those results, right? That is the whole idea of taking guidance from a pure devotee, or the whole system which of parampara and the whole spiritual sadhana process, right? So it just because my nature right now, or my mind right now may still be conditioned, but because I am strictly and sincerely following a pure process, such a person, by intentions, because they are pure, they are also to be considered pure.
So isn't that exercising our own free will as living entities? Isn't that exercising free will?
Yes, exactly. And for that to happen, it is not that just about rajas, sattva, or tamas. That only happens through what is called as mahat kripa. That is where we are actually mahat kripa means the mercy of a pure devotee, of a mahat, of an advanced soul, is so potent that it can extricate one out of the influence of these three gunas. And that is how the seed of bhakti begins, because bhakti is not a product of sattva, rajas, or tamas. Just because one is sattvic does not mean bhakti starts within them. It is a favorable ground, but the beginning of bhakti is not just a sattvic input or a result of sattva, but rather it comes from an external source, from Bhakti Devi herself, but manifesting the form of mahat kripa, the mercy of a advanced soul, like that.
Okay.